Welcome, everybody. Come on in. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're just letting everybody in from the waiting room. Thanks for your patience. All right. I think we've got most folks admitted. Probably more will continue to stream in, but I think I'll get us started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angie Hacker. I am the statewide best practices coordinator with the California Climate and Energy Collaborative. So the CEEC program is administered by the local government commission with funding from our sponsors, including Bay Ren, SoCal Ren, and 3C Ren. And we all would like to thank you for joining the CEEC Policymakers session today. This year's theme is Rebounding Resiliently, and I'm really fortunate to be joined by Eric DeCock, who is Deputy Director at California's Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and Alana Matthews, who is an impact attorney, energy and climate equity champion, and the Director of Policy Resources and Training at the Prosecutors Alliance of California. This interactive virtual gathering is designed to specifically talk with elected officials and other policymakers. So we really appreciate you making the time to be here. We know that policymakers across California are uniquely busy this year and are facing difficult decisions about how to best rebound from the hardships of 2020 and 2021 in ways that support their broader energy, climate, and equity goals. In the next hour and a half, this space is intended to provide an opportunity to highlight leading local actions and relevant policy updates. And so we're going to hear from our featured experts that are here with us today. You're going to get a chance to participate also in deeper discussions with each other through subsequent breakout sessions where you're going to be able to ask questions directly to the speakers and forge connections with other jurisdictions by exchanging knowledge, successes, and ideas with fellow local policymakers. So that's what we're in store for today. And a little bit of housekeeping. Next slide, please. Please be sure to keep yourself muted during the event. You can unmute when it's time to go into breakout sessions. We do encourage I got muted too, to use the chat box to introduce yourself, engage with other participants, or reach out to CEEC staff. And we've got Gabby, Serena, or myself today about any technical issues. And there will be time for Q&A during the breakout rooms, but not until then. So we'll wait till breakouts to get the discussion going. Okay, go ahead and advance the slide. So I get a little time here up front to talk about local groundbreaking successes. We've had, while it's been a difficult year, a lot of promising and encouraging successes in the local sphere. And so part of what we do at CEEC is to track and share information about promising local initiatives that are truly carving the path towards a sustainable energy and low carbon future. Now, before I hand it off to our speakers, I'm just going to take a few minutes to highlight and recognize some, but certainly not all, of the recent successes from local groundbreakers in communities like yours. So, it's been one of the first things we'll talk about is electrification, and it's been a big couple of years for electrification, which is considered to be by many a key component of decarbonizing our buildings. So just this month, the city of Encinitas became the 50th local government to adopt an electrification ordinance in California. And so a lot of the local government local ordinances focus on new construction. We're sort of seeing the next generation of these initiatives in cities like Berkeley and San Jose that are taking the next step to bring in all voices to plan an equitable approach to electrifying their existing building stock. Other local programs like Sonoma Clean Power, which is a CCA up north, have designed incentive programs that take it from a different angle. So policy and codes do one thing, incentives programs are designed to make it easier and more affordable to transition buildings from natural gas. Next slide, please. So on to climate action planning. According to the California Air Resources Board Climate Action Tool, we've got at least 200 local governments that have adopted climate action plans here in California. They are committing to strategies to reduce emissions from energy consumption and other sources. And some of the groundbreaking jurisdictions are showcasing how these plans can do more than count emissions. And so we're seeing places like Oakland taking a new and unique approach. So in July of 2020, the city of Oakland unanimously adopted a 2030 Equitable Climate Action Plan, which really, and I just did an interview with the city, exemplifies how to develop a climate action plan that is meaningfully rooted in equity and deep community engagement processes. And the result is a plan that aims to reduce emissions while also ensuring that frontline communities can benefit from adopted climate action strategies. And then another approach a little further south is from the city of San Luis Obispo, which was recognized with an Innovation in Green Community Planning Award for Excellence by the American Planning Association this year for its climate action plan for community recovery. And that aimed to reduce emissions while developing an economy that is set to recover from the impacts of COVID-19 and thrive in a rapidly changing 21st century. Next slide, please. I want to also recognize regional energy networks, and next year in 2022 will mark the 10-year anniversary since Bay Area local governments, Los Angeles County, first established something called a regional energy network, which was then a new mechanism to access significant ratepayer dollars for locally designed and regionally administered energy efficiency programs. So a collaboration also happened between Ventura, Santa Barbara, and SLO to form C3REN a few years ago. And these programs are designing really innovative ways to upgrade single-family, multifamily, commercial, and public buildings and support and upskill the workforce needed to complete these upgrades. The great thing is that the CPUC this year has codified a long-term future for the regional energy networks. And now we are seeing that there are at least 2 other RENs in development, including one called the Inland Regional Energy Network in inland Southern California. And RINs are providing a really promising path forward as we see fewer EE dollars reaching local government partnerships. Next slide, please. So speaking of local design and regionally administered programs, I would be remiss not to mention the market-changing impact of community choice aggregators, which have proliferated in California in the last several years. 200 jurisdictions in California have either established or joined a CCA, enabling 11 million customers to access energy chosen and procured with local values and goals. Those CCAs have now procured 6,000 megawatts in power purchase agreements with high renewable portfolios and profiles. The emission reduction potential is starting to be calculable in places like the city of Palm Springs, which reduced last year's emissions to 16% below levels a decade ago. And a large part of that was due to a collaboration with the community choice program, Desert Community Energy, which launched last year. One example of many. Next slide, please. So still on the topic of locally designed and regionally administered programs, California is now home to 7 regional climate collaboratives, as shown on this map. We have also seen something new called a Resilience Hub starting to pop up in places like NorCal. So Northern California has a NorCal Resilience Network. We can expect to see more of these given that the state has made a recent large investment in community resilience centers. Next slide, please. So California, as we all know, is prioritizing a transition to electric vehicles as well, including a new state mandate. Local governments obviously have a big role to play in realizing EV goals throughout the state. So the map here shows existing charging stations, and places like the city of Torrance have some unique initiatives that are going further. They have a 1 mile, 1 charger program that sought to increase access to publicly accessible EV charging in Torrance to support existing and future EV ownership. And so they've had the success of actually achieving a 98.6% rate of folks in the city that are now within 1 mile of a charging station. And then there's other programs that are offering incentives to support electric vehicle infrastructure and electric vehicle purchasing and procurement. like the city of Burlingame, which is offering incentives to help residents afford to purchase EVs. Next slide, please. Another big theme the last couple of years has been, an awakening to the importance of energy resilience, whether that be PS events or wildfire, but local governments are playing a greater and greater role in securing their local energy systems. For example, the city of Gonzales has a community microgrid. They crafted a brand new government entity to make the microgrid possible. It's a 35 megawatt, $70 million advanced community microgrid that's supporting economic development in their agricultural sector as well. And it's the largest multi-customer microgrid in California to date. The city of Santa Barbara has initiated a strategic energy plan, and the idea was to identify community and municipal distributed energy resource potential. So now they have a roadmap to meet their 100% renewable electricity goal by 2030, and it outlines potential projects for critical facilities with a focus on public-private partnerships. And then there's other programs with locally led organizations like Peninsula Clean Energy in Monterey that are offering battery backup and energy storage incentives as well, to make it more affordable for folks to increase their own energy resilience. Next slide, please. Benchmarking. Benchmarking is another critical piece of the pie and moving on to sustainable energy. The city of Brisbane actually adopted an ordinance in 2019 requiring most of its owners of local buildings over 10,000 square feet to benchmark, or basically be accountable and disclose information about their energy use to the city. So later, now in their beyond benchmarking stage, they're taking the next step to show that they are high performing or to take steps to improve. So now they're coming out with programs to help move folks along to lower their energy usage, and even creating a toolkit to help others in other communities move in the same direction. Similarly, in the city and county of San Francisco, they updated their 2011 existing building energy performance ordinance in 2019, and so far has evaluated over 3,000 buildings. Next slide, please. This is my last example, just transitions, and that might be a term that we're getting to be more familiar with and starting to figure out how to incorporate that into our work as we're tackling climate change and economic development and recovery. But there are programs out there that are having big successes in helping disadvantaged communities obtain support to transition to clean energy economies. So programs like the Strategic Growth Council's Transformative Climate Communities program and the Boost program, which is a partnership with ILJ, Institute for Local Government, they're helping disadvantaged communities move ahead. For example, the Transformative Climate Communities has funded lots of jurisdictions over the last several years, including the Northeast San Fernando Valley in Pacoima and Sun Valley, focusing on street enhancements, battery electric buses, electric chargers. So a lot of the programs are affordable housing with renewable energy and smart transit options, and these really holistic approaches to moving communities forward. And then I want to mention too that OPR, who we're going to hear from in just a moment, is also really diving into just transitions and is coming out with new programs, including the community, I think we'll hear about this, the SURF program, Community Economic Resilience Fund, and its High Road Just Transition program. So with that, I do want to move on to introducing our speakers, but I want to say, if you didn't hear your jurisdiction, it doesn't mean that you aren't leading the way. You probably have you will have plenty of opportunities later in the discussion to share about your groundbreaking actions within the breakouts. We'd also encourage you to ensure that your staff participates with us in the SEEK program and is part of the conversation so that we can help share the story of your successes. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the discussion. Thank you so much for being with me and recognizing those groundbreakers. I'm pleased to introduce Alana Matthews. She is an impact attorney, executive leader, and equity champion. She is a former prosecutor who transitioned from protecting victims and criminal justice to protecting vulnerable communities and environmental justice. She was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown as the public advisor for the California Energy Commission, where she developed the agency's Energy Equity Initiative, DEI, programs, and coordinated a multi-agency disadvantaged communities advisory group. She later served as the chief consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies, where she focused on environmental and climate equity. And she is the director of policy resources and training for the Prosecutors Alliance of California. Thank you so much for being with us, Alana. She's going to go first, and I will introduce Eric DeCock next. So thank you, Alana. I'll hand it off to you.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. And if you didn't see the note in the chat that invited everyone to come off camera, I would love to see your faces, but that's okay. I don't mind talking to letters as well. So just want to encourage you for that. So we're going to spend the next 15 minutes just talking about breaking down silos and building up collaborations for equitable resiliency. As you can see by my introduction, and thank you, Angela, for that, my career has taken some very different turns. And so I have broken down those silos within my own personal passion and professional path. And that's what I'm hoping to help each of you do as you move forward with a just transition, which is what we're trying to do. So climate change is more than just an environmental crisis. We all know that, right? It's a social crisis, and it compels us to address issues of inequity on multiple levels. So we know vulnerable communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so we have to ensure that our climate change and mitigation measures, resiliency programs don't exacerbate those vulnerabilities. So we really want to take some time to explore how do we rebound resiliently with inclusive policies and programs that engage vulnerable communities and not merely look at them as beneficiaries. So a quick little roadmap is, first, I just want to go through some foundational understanding of what is equitable resiliency and why do we want it. And then we'll talk about operationalizing equity. Sometimes there's a program, so as long as we engage in that program, we feel like we're engaged in the work of equity. So I want to go a little bit deeper into how do we operationalize that in everything we do, and not just specific programs that your jurisdiction may be participating in. And then we will end with some core principles or examples of how you can set up a framework to help you and however you want to approach that. Okay, next slide. Let's jump into it. So equitable resiliency, I just wanted to break that down into kind of like two columns and deal with what, first of all, is equity and what is resiliency. I'm sure if I asked everybody, to type in something in the chat, you'd have a lot of different questions. But I look at equity work as being community-centered. It's demonstrated through the fair treatment and meaningful involvement and representation of people within the communities we serve, regardless of their race, their color, their national origin, their income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of the laws, regulations, and policies. So 3 components of equity that should always be present is that we ensure all people have the opportunity to benefit from the solutions. Second, I think we want to make sure equity, while we want to make sure that everyone benefits from the solution, we also want to make sure it's not taking on an unequal burden of negative impacts. And equity is both a practice and a process that focuses on system changes. So that's sort of the general framework of why do we want equity? It benefits everyone and it doesn't negatively impact one group or the other. So when we talk about resiliency, what is it that we mean? It's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, climate and energy impacts, rebound quickly from extreme heat events, flooding, drought, wildfires, blackouts, or shutoffs. How do we rebound when we're talking about social impacts? Economic, housing, food, transportation, mobility, energy insecurity. So how do we rebound from those sorts of things? And then we also want to keep in mind the social impacts, because again, when we are talking about our most vulnerable communities, it's not just an environmental issue, it's multidimensional. So we want to look at how do we rebound from historical structural bias and discrimination. So a good example when we think of resiliency is 9/11, natural disasters, mass shootings. And sometimes we get in the climate and we just kind of like, again, that's an example of the silos because we kind of just want to stick in climate change. But when we talk about resiliency, look at these events that happen. Unfortunately, they're tragic and traumatic, but those are times when you see the resiliency of the community. And so the resiliency and the unity that usually comes about during those natural disasters, whether it's hurricanes or tsunamis or flooding, we want to have that same type of unity and cohesion and helping each other when we deal with climate resiliency. So resiliency is really the capacity of individuals, as I said before, communities, institutions, businesses, systems to survive, adapt, and thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. Next slide. So what are 4 pillars of operationalizing equity? Well, I look at them as community relationships, environmental justice, equitable governance, and adaptation and mitigation. So what do we mean by that? Think of this as, we understand what equity is and what equitable resiliency is. So, right, we kind of got that little bit of framework to start with. Then we want to go and take it to another level. And this is sort of, look at this as the who, what, how, and when. So when we're talking about equity, who are we talking about? Well, community relationships. So we want to make sure when we're talking about equity, that means we are fostering inclusive, community-centered engagement practices and decision-making processes by uplifting the capacities and abilities of communities that already make them resilient. When I was public advisor, a lot of times, some of the pushback I got was going into the community and wanting to learn, where a lot of the experts within the agency were used to just telling the information and saying, well, we know best. Now, they wouldn't say those words, we know best, but they would certainly, be indicative of how they approached it. And many cultures, indigenously or inherently, have a tremendous respect for the land and a relationship and respect for the environment. So we did have a lot to learn. So just meeting communities and looking at their resiliency, and we want to leverage that. Some of these communities face extreme economic hardships, but they bounce back and they make a way to survive. Some of them are challenged with a lot of public safety issues, but they manage to still survive every single day. So there's some inherent resiliency that we should acknowledge and make sure that that's being tapped in and leveraged as we move forward with our climate plans. Environmental justice. That means prioritizing frontline communities and the work that we do. So you show prioritization by the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. Again, as I said in the beginning, regardless of their race, color, national origin, income, or abilities, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. That is extremely important because sometimes, I know in a lot of our climate policies and programs, we have a set aside of like 25% or 10%. So we should shift to thinking to prioritizing, because these are the most hardest hit communities. So we want to just stop thinking of like, okay, this is an add-on or another program, but this is how we operationalize equity. If you think about how you may look at the cost of a program, if you know that you only have $100,000 for this program, almost everything that you do is going to be guided by, listen, this is all we have to work with. We got to make sure that we're always thinking about that. Well, that same mindset and framework would go for operationalizing equity. Okay, I know I got to get through this quicker. Equitable governance, that means guiding research, policy formulation, implementation, trainings. All of those processes have to be accessible. And then, of course, your long and short-term plans are being a part of making sure that your operation equity and you're thinking about both of those in the short term and long term, which I'm sure most jurisdictions. Next slide. So this is a participation spectrum that I love to use, and it shows there are 5 different categories. Are you informing? You're just giving information. It's one way. Are you consulting? Are you getting some information to share? But it's a spectrum for decision makers. And the last phase is empower. And that means you're taking the community from being a community that is just passively sitting where you're informing them to bringing them where they're empowered to make a decision making, to becoming the decision maker. And sometimes that happens like if you have a piece of land and you said, okay, community, tell us what all you want to do with that land. Well, they're actually making the decision. So that's an example of empower. So when we look at rebounding resiliently and doing it in a way that operationalizes equity, this is the spectrum that you want to be on. And you think of all these little dots, I have the little circles. You think of that as all the stakeholders. So you have your community members, your elected officials, your government agencies, your industry, your policy experts. They're all engaged in that process and treated equitably. Next slide. And then there is the equitable participation spectrum. So there are different types of equity. So we might be thinking of the last slide. That's if you're having a community meeting and how you decide that. But we have to keep in mind, and you can read this, you're going to get this slide. So there are different types of equity. So you have to make sure if it's procedural, if it's distributional, if it's structural, you have to have all those different layers and be mindful of that as you're operationalizing equity. Next slide. So these are some of the core principles that I would recommend everyone starts off with. And that's just simply saying people have a right to the resources required to create productive, dignified, ecological, sustainable livelihoods, including upholding people's rights to land, clean water, air, food, other resources. So it's really getting at a values-driven approach. Because sometimes if we're issues driven or we're programs driven, we might get locked down in other things. So we want to make sure that we are sharing these values. Earlier, when we started off the CEC sessions, I talked about the importance of having clean, healthy, safe, thriving communities. And I asked everyone to engage in an exercise where they close their eyes and they imagine what that would look like. Well, that's something that you want to do when you're trying to think about rebounding resiliently and equitably. What does that look like for everyone? Does everyone have land, housing, a place to stay, a place to rest and sleep? Does everyone have clean air, clean water? Does everyone have access to food and other resources, which are things I'm sure we all value and want everyone to have. But sometimes it's important to stand back and say, okay, is this particular program is dealing with transportation, but is it going to move us towards those particular values? So if it's transportation so that people can sustain their livelihood, or they have access to food, or they have access to recreation, which is important in this COVID environment. Sometimes we need that. All right, next slide. So here are 3 questions, and I hope that you can adjust your screen. You know how to do that if it seems very small to you, but building an equity framework. So you kind of have in your mindset how we can operationalize equity. Here are some concrete questions you can ask. How can we safeguard a just transition so that BIPOC, and if anyone is not familiar with that acronym, it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and frontline residents move to the front of the line for clean energy benefits? That's a hard question to ask, but I find all too often many people aren't asking those questions. How can we ensure that their voices are not only heard, but prominent, that they are not the only recipients, but the architects of this clean energy future? And then a third question, and how can we work to recognize and rectify the historical legacies of racial and economic injustices to usher in an equitable clean energy future? So what's important, if we can go back to slide number 4. Can we go back slides? Oh, I'm sorry if I threw us off. Okay, yes, there we are. So just as you see these little pillars for the participation, just imagine if this was education, healthcare, economic development, just all of the different, we know that there are social issues. So you look at the criminal justice system. All right, now we can advance back to the slide that we were in. I'm sorry, I took you off. I believe we were at slide number 7. Yes, so when you look at that equity framework, those sorts of questions, how can we safeguard a safe transition? Those sorts of questions are being asked in the field of education. It's also being asked in the field of healthcare or in the field of housing. And so when you break down those silos, rather than just thinking about this in terms of just clean energy or mitigation, especially when you're elected officials and you have the opportunity to be dealing with a multitude of issues, it's great to break down those silos. We have a utility here, a municipal utility that's created a map, and they've overlaid the Cal Enviro screen with some of the economic development. And they just started saying, okay, what do communities need? And that's where they began to build the framework of addressing and making sure they're prioritizing and protecting the most vulnerable communities. Next slide. So this is a checklist I've just shared with you. It's from Hawaii and their Office of Resiliency. I just have it. And then when you get this slide, I believe you'll also have the website. I know it's really tiny to see right now, but I think it's a great tool that you can use. And I definitely wanted to have to give that away. Last slide. I think this is going to be my last slide. Yes. So it's questions, but again, we are reserving that to the breakout session. So you probably have a couple, and I'll be happy to answer at that time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alana. Alana is obviously going to stick around and be with us in the breakouts after the next segment, another 15 minutes. So I want to introduce our next speaker. Again, it's Eric DeCock, and he's going to share what's next for state tools and resources for local action. And so Eric is the Deputy Director for Planning and Community Development at OPR. He leads, coordinates, and supports the team's efforts on policy development and developing local and regional planning guidance and furthering the state's planning priorities and climate goals. He has over 20 years of public, private, and nonprofit sector planning experience, including with Ascent Environmental, the City of Sacramento, and several New York City-based consulting firms. We're really lucky to have him here today, especially with everything happening at the state level under the governor's office. So take it away, Eric. Thanks so much for being here.
Great, thank you so much, Angie. Great to be in the room today, and great presentation, Alana. I just love everything you said. I think it's a great segue into what I'm about to talk about next, on really the role of local and regional action and collaboration and how to advance equity and what the state's trying to do to help move all this forward. Next slide, please. So I think Alana covered a lot of this already in her remarks, but I'm just going to go ahead and start off by saying that, at OPR, we believe that local action matters, and it's so crucial to advancing the state's climate goals. The state obviously can't meet all these big long-term climate goals alone for 2030, 2045, 2050. We really do rely, and the state really is relying on local action and leadership to move the ball forward in meeting these goals. Almost everything in our adopted plans and policies, with the exception of a few regulatory activities that the state and federal governments have authority over, are ultimately implemented locally. So we fully understand the critical need for local action. And just building on Alana's remarks, I think we also firmly believe and are actively promoting across OPR, our sister agency, SGC, the Strategic Growth Council, who I'll talk about later. We really need to be enabling and empowering local community-driven action, and that word empowerment, right? Collaborate, empowering, moving the needle beyond just consulting and informing our citizenry, but really actively engaging them and empowering them to be leaders in this movement and making sure that the changes we see are transformative and moving the needle forward on building and advancing equity in our historically under-resourced and kind of disadvantaged communities. And on the subject of adaptation and resilience, I think we also all recognize that we need to start in adapting and building resilience in our communities now. Obviously, a lot of folks have been talking about this, about the need for adaptation to climate for years and years. But as we've all seen with COVID-19, the pandemic, the major public health crisis, we're seeing that some of the unfortunate effects of systemic racism are becoming so much more visible and apparent in the data we're seeing about who's most impacted. And it begins us to cause to think about the public health crisis and how climate's connected to that crisis and how can we best address this. So obviously thinking about our vulnerable and disadvantaged communities who are already suffering the most, really thinking about that as a frame for moving forward and thinking about equity and justice in this realm. So again, local and regional action is just so critical. And I think that's a really, as we've, OPR, SGC staff and numerous other state agencies collaborated around an ambitious climate agenda, which I'll talk about next. This is so central to almost everything we're doing about it, really centering the needs of our most vulnerable and under-resourced communities. So next slide, please. So when we think about action, what's meaningful climate action, it's obviously I'm emphasizing local and regional action and collaboration in my remarks so far here. I think we all get that this does require cross-sector and cross-agency, cross-government layer alignment and collaboration. And so that can look like a lot of different things, right? There's interjurisdictional collaboration. We've talked about regional climate collaboratives already. We've also really recognized, maximizing, leveraging the need for funding for diverse and diverse needs and purposes, and I'm going to cover that in detail soon. We're going to talk about capacity building and just the importance of empowering our community-based leaders to advance climate equity. I will actually highlight some very specific programs that the state has created and hopes to scale up based on the new big climate package that was just signed by the governor last week. And also just the need for knowledge exchange and peer learning and making sure that locals have the tools and resources needed to advance the next generation of actions we need to take. So next slide, please. Let's start off with funding. I'm going to be giving some highlights from the fiscal year 21-22 state budget, which was most of it was signed in June as on schedule. But as many of you know, the governor and the legislature took a couple extra months this year to negotiate and hammer out some really important details on what we're calling the climate action and resilience package, or the climate action package, as the governor said last week. It is a historic investment of $15 billion. And just for context, we used to talk about a couple $100 million in California as being an aggressive investment. So we've really scaled things up here. And obviously, as you can see, it's not just a greenhouse gas mitigation package. It sort of spans this whole idea of resilience and taking action to reduce emissions and make advancements on our energy needs. Obviously, there's a pretty big chunk in wildfire and forest resilience, just given the scale of the problems that we're seeing out there. We've got $5.2 billion aimed at water and drought resilience, 3.7 on climate resilience, which is actually most of what I'll be talking about today. We have climate smart agriculture, ZEVs, and the new cap and trade expenditure plan at about $3.9 billion. Circular economy, in other words, the waste sector, $270 million. So you can see it's quite a smorgasbord of what we're calling a climate package. But you just know that there's so much in here that has never really been funded at these levels before, especially in the climate resilience, or what we're calling the community resilience space. There's just a lot of massive increases in investment there. And I did put the URL on the screen for those of you that haven't had the time to look yet. There is a very specific place where you can get all the details on all of the buckets in the climate resilience packages. It is on the state's e-budget website under a very specific addendum that was posted last week. So make sure you take a look at that after the webinar today. Next slide, please. So the big focus of my remarks here now on funding is more on that climate resilience, that community resilience, the $3.7 billion bucket. A historic first of its kind, really $800 million extreme heat program. We have a $1.37 billion multi-benefit and nature-based solutions bucket. There's the ocean and coastal resilience. We've got community resilience, and then a smattering of other programs. So I've highlighted the two big pieces of this sub-piece of the climate package that I'll talk about next, which is extreme heat and community resilience. Next slide, please. So under extreme heat, that $800 million bucket, there is a smattering of state agencies and new programs or extensions or modifications of programs we're talking about. There will be a pretty massive increase in the amount of urban greening funding to the tune of $250 million. We do have a low-income weatherization pot at about $50 million this year. $200 million program on community resilience centers and an extreme heat and community resilience program. That will actually be run out of my department. And that, just to be specific, there will be actual grants for the development, the planning and development of community resilience centers. That actually is an additional to the $250 million that was given to the Department of Food and Agriculture. So actually in aggregate, there's a $450 million pot for community resilience, which is great. OPR will be working on an extreme heat framework. We've already begun some of these discussions through the work that we're doing on the state's adaptation strategy framework. And out of that, we believe a program will develop, and which will also inform how to spend that $300 million extreme heat set aside. Right now, it's kind of flexible, and it would require new appropriations starting in the next fiscal year once that extreme heat framework is put together. So there's some interrelationships there that we're just still working out. But obviously there's going to be a huge increase. And I think from my perspective, just thinking this through and knowing who's in the room today, the extreme heat framework is so important because it does build on a lot of the great work being done in the energy sector, especially around the built-in environment and our energy grid and its reliability. We know that so much of our built environment is not resilient today, and it is not using energy well. So there's a huge opportunity here through this extreme heat investment to really pair investments in building retrofits, grid reliability, and all sorts of programs that can converge around both saving energy, cutting carbon, as well as building resiliency in the building stock. So this is a historic opportunity to align efforts, hit both sides of the climate coin, and we're just really excited to be moving this forward in the coming next 2 to 3 fiscal years. Next slide, please. Taking a deeper dive on that $800 million community resilience portion of the climate resilience package, we do have a $420 million investment through the Transformative Climate Communities program. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that next. We also have the Regional Climate Collaboratives program. Also, we'll be covering that next. The Climate Adaptation and Resilience Planning Grants. It's a fairly small initial program, but we believe that will help local agencies come into compliance with the SB 379 requirements for the safety element, as well as just generally leveraging support for broader base local and regional climate adaptation planning. There is a $250 million regional community climate resilience program that's additional to that $25 million grants program for planning. So we're excited about that. Some of that will go to planning, some could go to some implementation. So a lot of that still needs to be worked out through guidelines and a stakeholder outreach. So that's a brand new $250 million regional resilience program that we weren't even really expecting. So that was really a fun surprise. And just some really other important investments in conservancies, and also our Climate Action Corps, a $14 million investment for Cal volunteers as well. And last but not least, a big boost into the Cal EPA's Environmental Justice Initiative at the tune of $25 million, which we're really excited about to learn more about from our partners over there. Next slide, please. So just to get into some specifics now, you heard a lot of numbers on the screen, and we're kind of drilling down in different pieces of this huge climate budget. I did want to talk about how important that $420 million allocation is for our Transformative Climate Communities program. You know, this program operated by our sister agency, the Strategic Growth Council, is all about community-led transformation to enable California communities who are most impacted by pollution to choose their own goals, strategies, and projects to both reduce emissions, local air pollution, and to adapt to climate change. So, this will be the 3rd or 4th year of the program. To date, we've already invested over $229 million across the state through the TCC program, including definitely at least $48 million earmarked specifically in disadvantaged communities. And what's exciting about the TC program, it is highly collaborative. It does require stakeholders, lead agencies, and stakeholders together across sectors to come together to formulate planning grant proposals. And then once the planning grants are approved and the plans are created, there are investment grants as well that pair and help to implement those plans. So really important program that sort of addresses a lot of the linchpins of the state's climate agenda, and really, we think, helps to move things forward in our most needed communities. Next slide, please. Some of the project types that TCC funds range, it's a pretty broad range. It can be affordable and sustainable housing. It can be transit stations, transit facilities, active transportation infrastructure. It can pair some funding to match up with the low-income weatherization projects, solar projects, water efficiency, food waste prevention, you name it. Everything on the slide here are good examples of things that we've already funded and the kind of activities that could be in a TCC application for both planning and implementation. Next slide, please. I did want to talk really quickly on capacity building and just the important facet of equity building that we're already doing through SGC. We do a lot of work through technical assistance already across the suite of California climate investment programs through a number of technical assistance partners. So that work continues. I've put on the left side of the slide here some examples of what we're doing through the CASE team there. Also want to highlight the pilot programs that the CASE team has been actively promoting already. We have the Partners Advancing Climate Equity, or the PACE program, which is actually in the SGC team's view, a pilot program for what's on the right side of the slide, which is the Regional Climate Collaborative. So through PACE, we're engaging 2 to 3 dozen community leaders who are all directly engaged already in their communities, and they come from under-resourced and disadvantaged communities. And they're being brought to the table to just be part of this pilot program to figure out how can they best advance climate equity in their own communities. And so there's some training involved, there's some peer learning, there's some networking, there's a lot of sharing of information across participants as well as across agencies about how to best support those efforts. And the BOOST program as well. Some of you are familiar with the Institute for Local Government, who's our implementation partner working on that program as well, where there is direct technical assistance to agencies, as well as some collaborating organizations on how to really access funds and be successful in some of the work that's on the ground to advance climate planning and implementation. And so this Regional Climate Collaboratives program that we've talked about, I will say that while it's a really cool term, it's not the same thing as the climate collaboratives have already been formed out there for adaptation. It's a slightly different meaning, so there's a bit of confusion, but it is a term that was created and a program that was in theory created by Senate Bill 1072 back in 2018 by Senator Leyva. And now it has been funded. That was one of the big wins in this year's climate budget, was we now actually have a $20 million appropriation to go ahead and scale up this program. And again, it's based on the lessons learned and some of what we've already started to work through, the SGC team's work through some of the pilot programs I mentioned earlier. So it will be a competitive program. However, it is very much based on this idea of collaboration and communities coming together with, partnerships with CBOs, cross-agency partnerships and CBOs working together to access those dollars and then build a pipeline to secure more funding. So my timer is going off, which means I'm going to go a little bit over time if I don't speed up. So next slide, please. I just wanted to end by saying that, tools and resources, there's a lot of other things that the state is working on that can help support a local action. I happen to be a planner and kind of a geography nerd. I studied geography and it's part of my education. So I just really love maps. And I love the fact that the state has tried to make it a little bit easier for everyone across the state to understand what kind of planning is happening in the climate space. Our colleagues over at CARB did create something called the Climate Action Portal Map, or the CAP map. Angie, I saw you took a little snapshot as well as the map in one of your slides, but this is a cool map because it shows you who's developed or adopted a climate action plan. It also tells you, if you click on the polygon, a nice pop-up box comes up and you can look at what kind of targets were set, what sort of actions were taken or at least planned. So that's a great tool to just understand climate action planning in that landscape. My colleagues over at OPR's ICARP program, the Integrated Climate Adaptation Resilience Program, also have created a map called the Resilient California Adaptation Planning Map. It's sort of like the CAP map, but it is a little bit more focused on adaptation and resilience planning, and it is available at the URL listed there. So another great resource on mapping. And in a very similar way, it is interactive, just like the CAP map. You can click on and get some information about what that community is doing. Next slide, please. So, and again, more information. I put some URLs here. I know you guys, URLs here. I know you will all get a copy of the presentation, so feel free to peruse those resources. And with that, I think that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. We see our role at SEEK is to help keep you informed as these dollars start making their way into becoming available in programs. A lot here for local governments. I have to say, as a local climate professional, I'm regularly in California. So you've heard now about how locals are leading the way, how we can break down silos and build up collaborations for equitable resiliency, and now how we can collaborate with the state, which is making historic investments in rebounding resiliently. So it's now time to unleash you all into the discussion. Participants are going to be automatically assigned to a breakout room for 35 minutes. And there's going to be 3 groups of breakout sessions, 10 minutes each, but you'll stay in the same room and you don't have to worry about anything because you'll just get shuffled over to the right room and you'll stay there. So each of the 3 speakers, so myself, Alana, and Eric, we are all going to be the facilitators of a breakout session, and we're going to rotate around, and we're going to take the first thing we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions if there are any for us as speakers. And then each of us has 1 question we're going to deliver to each room and discuss. So each of those discussions will be about 10 minutes per question. Speakers are going to then report out what sort of a summary of what was discussed on their question afterwards. And so that pretty much takes us to the end of our program. I do want to ask you to please go ahead and join us in the Jamboard. Jamboard is just a piece of software where we can make virtual sticky notes. It's pretty simple to use. You sort of just are going to make a sticky note and add your comments and notes there. But these are intended to be breakout discussions that are verbal, out loud discussions as well. So I think in the chat, we are seeing the link for the Jamboard, and folks at LGC, go ahead and shuffle us into our rooms, please. All right, hi, we're coming back. Gabby, are you going to share your screen again to get us to the report back section?
I'm on it right now.
Right. Well, I found that really fun, and I really appreciate those of you who stuck around for that and contributed some thoughts. We are going to just do a quick report out. Each of the facilitators will take a little turn to kind of summarize what was discussed within their groups. It was really fun to kind of hop around and meet you all. I can go first since I'm first up here. So my question was, how did the hardships of 2020 and 2021 affect your local government's ability to pursue its clean energy and climate goals? And actually, I don't know, Gabby, if you'd rather share share the Jamboard, but I thought we had some really good conversation. And what was surprising? Some communities did not feel that they were held back as much as maybe I was expecting. And it sounded like there was a difference between the communities that were larger and better resourced and had staff, and communities that were smaller and maybe more dependent on contractors and felt that they had to push some things off or delay some things, like transitioning to their electric vehicle fleets. But lots of folks are continuing to move forward, and that sounded like partially to do with the function of some of the funds that have come. And we sort of looked at the bright sides and silver linings around, out of the ashes of disaster sometimes comes opportunity, where we're starting to see big investments in some of the areas that were lacking investment, whether that be wildfire, climate change, equity, helping us to solve these more systemic problems. And so folks are really excited about the ARPA funds that have come, and that seemed like it held some folks over during this gap period where we know that budget cuts were experienced and tax revenue shortages were experienced, that there was probably some level of concern about staff capacity. But ARPA has come in and provided some relief, and folks are now looking forward, but it sounds like, with some level of confusion about where the funds are. There's a lot of funds coming. There are some communities that seem a little concerned about whether they have the capacity to go after and track all of it. And so we are excited at the SEEK program to be supportive in that way and to help connect the local governments that want to be pursuing these new opportunities to them as they come. And so I'm going to be posting some things in the chat for ways that you can kind of be with us as we're trying to communicate and support you in accessing those opportunities. So that's mine, and I want to thank everybody for that discussion. I think we will move to, I think is it Alana next?
Yes, so I'm happy to go next. My question was, what would it look like in your community if California rebounded resiliently? We had great feedback, and I think we had a great cross-section of communities. So we had coastal, urban, big metropolitan areas, smaller towns, suburban cities. So it was great to see that almost everyone focused on sort of the immediate needs of the community members that would be met. And that included having affordable housing, multifamily housing, or realizing that a lot of people who work in their community can't live in the community. So looking at alternative solutions as we rebound resiliently, which could possibly include for construction of new affordable housing, having construction workers have recreational vehicles that they can safely park and live, for a few days if they're working a schedule, and then be able to go home. And it also looks like having a good quality of life. So not just having a good quality environment, having a good quality of life and being able to see your family. We also talked about, which I kind of added that in, is, use of district attorneys, again, breaking down those silos. And so that, you're realizing that there might be a public safety issue, or there might be other opportunities to collaborate and work with one another to have solutions to have more clean, healthy, safe communities. We also talked about rebounding resiliently looks like having agency and community participation, so that the community could have their own voice, but that they could also not just passively listen to information, they'd be more engaged and part of the decision-making process. And then the last thing is, for some communities, having a greater understanding of bias and prejudice and discrimination and racism, so that is not an intended consequence or unintended consequence of any of the actions. And then lastly, we also talked about, again, being responsive to the immediate needs. So individuals who are focused on, health impacts, or they understand, clean energy vehicles, but they are not affordable and accessible to them. So how can we have a greater connection and communication with the most vulnerable communities? So what it would look like to rebound resiliently is that we would have effective communication, which means they aren't only providing the relevant information, but we're making it accessible, so that if it's in another language, it's not limited to social media, but understanding how different communities get their information and making sure it's in the language and medium where they can actually access it.
Alana, thank you. And I'm realizing we have gone over time, and I want to give a short amount of time to Eric, and I don't mean to cut you short, but we'll have to close off here pretty soon.
Yeah, well, I'll be really quick. I think one of the things we heard about, how can the state better support locals in all of your work, definitely helping you understand how to access the monies, what can they be used for, that was loud and clear. So we are working that. We'll be sending out a fact sheet, some really cool materials we'll be posting on our website. So that should help. Being in conversation with you regularly and what kind of assistance you need, maybe even having a state liaison that can work with you. I think that's something that we've talked about for a long time, and we tend to do that work collaboratively as well with our LGC and our ILG partners as well. But definitely we would love to have the staff available to really serve as a full-time liaison. So that's something we bring up time and time again with the legislature and our DOF to fund that. We would love to be more engaged with you as you're working on your local climate targets and goals and implementation. That was a suggestion of being more in the channel and helping to connect locals with examples of who's doing this great work. So all really good ideas and stuff that I'm going to take back to my team for sure, making sure we're connecting back with this. So, and also just on that point of being connected, you know where to find me. My contact information will be on the slide you're going to get. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. Angie, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much, everybody, for all of your time, for our speakers. Thank you so much for your expertise. Eric, I'd love to coordinate with you and help wherever I can. Alana, we really appreciate your insights. Thank you. Everybody, we appreciate you, and we will be back in touch with the slides and more information following this session. We will see you next time. Thank you.